Hello, and welcome to Video Lecture 4, Globalization and Organizational Ethics. You heard that right, just Lecture 4, no A or B. This is the only video lecture this week. You've got plenty on your plate with that preliminary report coming up. You do remember that's due this week, right? So on to globalization and global organizational ethics. We explained the adjective global in week 1 and its use in phrases like global business or global organization. But we've not yet dealt with the noun, globalization, which describes an important part of the world in the 21st century. So, we're going to talk about globalization and global organizational ethics. We first need to ask exactly what we mean by globalization. Globalization does not simply refer to the export-import industry, which is as old as business itself. Rather, by globalization, we are referring to the highly complex integration of businesses around the world, including the fact that it is now commonplace for large businesses to own and operate or contract with businesses in many different countries around the globe. These are the so-called multinational corporations and global corporations we described in week 1.
Globalization on the scale we witness it today has been made possible by two major developments over the past couple of generations. First is the availability of inexpensive and rapid transportation from any part of the world to any other part. And most of all, to the advent of information technology, which makes communication and data sharing virtually instantaneous around the world. So, stockbrokers in New York can conduct business on the Tokyo Exchange with the click of a mouse. Executives in San Francisco can confer face-to-face in real time with subordinates in Sydney, Australia. Inventory and storage in Budapest can be sold to a multinational conglomerate operating out of Johannesburg by a distributor stationed in Buenos Aires in a matter of seconds. Another few seconds are all that is required to arrange with a shipping company based in Bangkok to move the inventory to Casablanca. An executive in Chicago who learns of labor problems at a plant in Vietnam can be on site to discuss the problem with local managers overnight. And an American-based manufacturer who sees his production costs rising out of control can solve the problem by purchasing or leasing factories in South Korea or in Mexico, where labor and materials cost pennies on the dollar. The logistical implications of such possibilities are staggering. So are the ethical implications. Globalization has significantly altered the business ethics and organizational ethics landscape. Now, according to the International Labor Organization, a multinational corporation is, quote, a corporation which has its management headquarters in one country, known as the home country, and operates in several other countries, known as host countries. So, if a corporation in the U.S. opens a manufacturing plant in Vietnam, the U.S. is the home country of that plant, while Vietnam is the host country. Host country operations may include productions of raw materials, productions of saleable products, assembling, packaging, marketing, distributing, or any other phase of the value chain. Now, two countries as far apart and culturally different as the United States and Vietnam are going to have significantly different norms of behavior and values being served by those behaviors. This This obvious disparity of cultural expectations raises an important question about the moral principles we presented earlier. Do these principles apply globally? Can we use them in moral decision making in Vietnam or South Korea or Australia or Madagascar or Argentina like we use them in Atlanta and San Antonio and Minneapolis and New York City? The question brings out the issue of cultural moral relativism. Now, individual moral relativism is the view we were alluding to in Lecture 1B when we considered the claim that morality is just a matter of opinion. Individual moral relativism holds that right and wrong is determined simply by the opinions and personal beliefs of the individual. As long as we do what we think is the right thing, we are doing the right thing. Cultural moral relativism is an extension of this view. Rather than the individual being able to determine what is right or wrong for himself, it is the individual's culture that makes this call. In other words, the right thing for me to do is that which my culture tells me is the right thing to do. So morality is not just a matter of opinion. It is, however, a matter of cultural opinion, so to speak. But it doesn't take much pondering to realize that cultural moral relativism falls prey to the same criticisms that individual moral relativism does. In fact, we expanded into cultural relativism when we considered the fact that the Old South before the Civil War was of the collective opinion that there was nothing wrong with slavery. If moral relativism of any stripe is true, then it follows that in the Old South in the first half of the 19th century there was nothing wrong with slavery. It was the opinion of that culture that it was just fine. Even many of the slaves thought so. If cultural moral relativism is true, then there's nothing wrong in today's world with the systemic oppression of women, foot binding, female circumcision, human trafficking, and many other diabolical practices, each of which is accepted as a part of life in many parts of the world. But of course, no one I know would actually accept this judgment. And if someone did, I would not consider this a controversial topic to be debated. I would consider that person someone to be avoided. Is morality a matter of opinion? Well, sometimes it seems like everybody says it is, but no one believes that it is. Do these principles apply globally? Yes, they do. But just because we take them overseas does not mean they suddenly stop being what they are. They are still open-ended, prima facie, conflicting, and possibly overridable, with no set hierarchy. Just because we have the principles doesn't mean our moral work is finished. In fact, it's just begun, and it will be more difficult, more unclear, and more important than any issues we will ever face at home. Now, it goes without saying that I'm going to say it anyway, that everything we've just said about the applicability of moral principles in a global setting applies also to the organization-specific principles we discussed in Lecture 3C and earlier in this one. To illustrate how natural it is to extend our fundamental moral principles to global contexts, consider Hasbro's global business ethics principles in this week's readings. Every one of these principles can be traced to one of our 14 foundational moral principles, and many of them can also be grounded in one of our organization-specific principles. For instance, the very first principle against forced labor, as well as many others on the list, is clearly grounded in our principle of respect for rights. Hasbro's third principle on wages and benefits is a clear application of the principle of justice. Number 8, forbidding acceptance of advantages, is an exercise in honesty and its corollary, fiduciary duty. In fact, and this is a foreshadowing for the rest of this lecture, I believe all 13 of Hasbro's principles can be clearly grounded in one of the 3 primary goods we have come to know well. Recall that these goods are, first, autonomy, the right to have a say in all decisions that significantly affect our lives; rationality, the right to any information required for us to make rational autonomous decisions or understand decisions being made on our behalf; and well-being, the right to psychological, social, and physical health and opportunities for self-improvement. Now, recall the home country, host country tension we discussed just a few slides ago. Just how does our observation that cultural moral relativism is false square with the contrasting norms and values between home and host countries that are so obvious and undeniable? Well, I'm glad you asked that question, because this is precisely why I assigned the HBR reading from Thomas Donaldson, Values in Tension, Ethics Away from Home. Donaldson agrees that there are universal moral principles, but warns that it does not follow from this that cultural differences mean nothing when deliberating over moral dilemmas. Any moral decision made by an organizational leader in a multinational or global setting must recognize and properly respect the home-host tensions involved, and be sure to give host country cultural norms and values their proper due. Donaldson proposes 3 guiding principles for global business ethics, and for our purposes, global organizational ethics. The first principle is respect for core values. Donaldson calls these core human values the absolute moral threshold. In other words, these core human values have the final say in any moral dilemma. If an option we have will violate those core human values, then that option is morally wrong. End of story. So these core human values are not prima facie. He's not talking about the moral principles we've been discussing. Now, in other work he has published, Donaldson refers to these values as hypernorms. He and co-author Thomas Dunphy define hypernorms as principles so fundamental that they constitute norms by which all other principles are to be judged. So the general principles and organization-specific principles we have been considering are norms that are legitimated because they are consistent with these hypernorms. I take Donaldson to be talking, in his language about hypernorms, to be talking about something very much like our 3 primary goods: autonomy, rationality, and well-being. It would be a good and interesting exercise to go through all principles we've named so far and show how they are all justified by reference to one or more of the 3 primary goods. So, we will consider the primary goods to be Donaldson's core human values, or hypernorms, the absolute moral threshold below which no morally acceptable decision can dip. Now, Davidson's second guiding principle is respect for local traditions. Here is the home-host tension in full relief. Despite the existence of an absolute moral threshold, we must still allow for understandings of proper behavior within the host country that are, or appear to be, in conflict with the home country's understanding of moral behavior. Donaldson and Dunphy call such apparently conflicting understandings legitimate norms. These legitimate norms are cultural rules, customs, or expectations that may conflict with the moral sensibilities of other cultures but are nonetheless consistent with the hypernorms. In such circumstances, it would be morally wrong for home country organizations to forbid or discourage these legitimate norms. In so doing, they are themselves the ones in the wrong, because they are violating the primary goods of host country citizens. But the key point that must not be missed is that Donaldson is calling for a respect for local traditions that are consistent with the hypernorms, or, for our purposes, the primary goods. Now, Donaldson's third principle is an understanding that context matters in moral decision making. The very existence of things such as legitimate norms points out to us that context makes a difference. An action that seems morally wrong to us can be perfectly fine in a different cultural context. In fact, it may even be morally wrong for us to forbid the action or take measures to prevent it. The general lesson here is that a firm commitment to hypernorms, to foundational moral principles that cannot be transgressed, is perfectly consistent with a great deal of open-mindedness when it comes to personal and social practices in host countries that the home country management and leaders may find questionable or even offensive and unacceptable. Local tradition matters. Context matters, but ultimately the primary goods matter. Well, I want to make some closing remarks about global organizational ethics in light of Donaldson's principles, but we need to clean up this slide a bit and make some room. There, that should do it. Notice, by the way, the important role that the second and third of Donaldson's principles play. These two serve to balance out a rush to uphold the hypernorms by mitigating against home country prejudices. A critical step in deliberating on moral dilemmas in a global setting is being able to distinguish between what actually serves the hypernorms, the primary goods, and what our home country norms might prefer. We must work hard to keep our understanding of the demands of the hypernorms separate from our own traditions and limited understandings of moral behavior. This focus on the legitimate norms of other cultures and the importance of context will save us from promoting our own cultural prejudices at the expense of other cultures' rights to determine their own behavioral preferences. So, let's summarize some things here before we move on to specific global organization issues. First, the foundation of our moral reasoning in global issues will be the primary goods. We are taking these as the hypernorms of which Donaldson spoke. We also have a new understanding of our moral principles, both general and organization specific. These principles can be understood as justified by, and even derivative of, the primary goods. Honesty, non-parasitism, protection of employee rights, and all of the others are properly understood as specific applications of one or more of our hypernorms. Furthermore, we can gain new insight regarding the prima facie nature of our principles and how to think about resolving principle conflicts. The reason principles are prima facie and may be overridden is because of Davidson's third principle: context matters. Principles carry different levels of strength and applicability in different contextual settings. This is especially true of cross-cultural and global contexts. And when consideration of different contexts reveals conflicts among moral principles, A key question to consider in resolving this conflict is the key to which our different options are in this context, consistent with and in service to the primary goods. The overriding principle is the one that, when applied, will best serve the protection of the primary goods of those affected. And finally, we can also gain insight into the open-ended nature of our list of principles. As different contexts give rise to different ways to protect and serve the primary goods, we learn new principles to help us in generalizing and guiding such protection and service. Our moral principles are essentially guidelines for some of the most effective ways to uphold the primary goods in a variety of different contexts. Now, let's close this lecture with a quotation from Donaldson's article, which can speak for itself. Companies must help managers distinguish between practices that are merely different and those that are wrong. For relativists, nothing is sacred and nothing is wrong. For absolutists, many things that are different are wrong. Neither extreme illuminates the real world of business and organizational decision-making. Respect core human values. Respect local traditions. Understand that context matters. Global organizational ethics in a nutshell.